Right, well, good afternoon, everyone. I am mindful, being the first speaker after lunch, that I've got to make sure to keep your attention. Also mindful that my biological clock is telling me it's 10:30 at night right now. So bear with me. And I want to thank you, Air Marshal Davies, Air Commodore Edgley, Auntie Tina, and Uncle Harry for the opportunity to speak here at this forum and to share this stage with so many other distinguished speakers today. And I'm excited to talk about this timely and important topic of the future of security in space. Now, to understand the future of security in space, we first need to understand a bit of our past, how we got to where we are today. For almost as long as humans have been able to place objects into Earth orbit, space has been a contested domain. It's easy to forget that the United States tested the first anti-satellite weapon in 1959. That was just 2 years after the launch of Sputnik. And throughout the Cold War, both the United States and the Soviet Union developed and tested a variety of anti-satellite weapons. Now, thankfully, none of these were used in anger, but the threat was ever present. So sometimes I'm taken aback when I hear people say that what's different is that space is now a contested domain, because it's always been contested. Now, what has changed in space that's causing people to become so concerned? Well, you've heard about the 3 C's: congested, competitive, and contested. And I'm hopeful that when you leave here today, you'll also remember the 4 D's: diverse, disruptive, disordered, and dangerous. Now, I would argue that the first 2, diverse and disruptive, are actually positive developments, but the latter 2 are a bit concerning. Space has become more diverse because more countries are launching satellites than ever before. You know, during the Cold War, it was primarily just the United States and the Soviet Union. Over 90% of the launches from 1957 to 1991 were from either the US or the Soviets. But today, there's a wide variety of nations that are launching and operating satellites. It's become much more diverse, and we see a lot more commercial firms are getting into the space business. Also, during the Cold War, satellites that were on orbit were primarily government and primarily military. But today, the majority of satellites going up are commercial. Space has also become more disruptive because many of these new commercial space firms are bringing all sorts of new ideas and new applications for space. Things like robotic on-orbit servicing in geostationary orbit and on-orbit mining and manufacturing. It's an exciting time, and it may fundamentally change the way we use space and operate in space, both commercially and militarily. But at the same time, these forces are making space more disordered than ever before. Our laws, regulations, and treaties weren't designed for many of these new space missions, and many of our nations are struggling to keep up. A good example of the disorder I'm talking about here occurred just recently with the controversy a small space startup company in the U.S. created when it was denied by the U.S. Federal Communications Commission to launch a set of 4 experimental satellites, but it went ahead and it launched them anyway on an Indian rocket. And as space has become more diverse, disruptive, and disordered, it has also become more dangerous. And I say this for 2 reasons. I'll go into them in a bit more detail. First, the way we use space systems has changed. Throughout the Cold War, U.S. national security space systems were protected by the cloak of nuclear deterrence because these systems were primarily used to support nuclear forces. We had an understanding with the Soviets that we would not interfere with either country's national technical means. And doing so would have been perceived as a prelude to a nuclear attack. But today, our national security space systems are used across the full spectrum of conflict, from counterterrorism operations to high-end combat against a near-peer adversary, all the way up to nuclear deterrence. And I should note that only at an air power conference can I get away with putting a slide up here. that depicts the full spectrum of conflict using only airborne platforms. So please don't tell any land power advocates that I'm doing this. But the United States, Australia, and our allies in Europe and the Asia-Pacific region have integrated advanced space systems into military operations in increasingly sophisticated ways. Space systems give our militaries global reach, power, and influence. And to be sure, potential adversaries have taken notice of this. Our dependence on space makes these systems a natural target for adversaries to exploit. They are developing counter-space systems designed to thwart our advantages in space. And as you can see, they aren't doing it secretly either. I'm particularly amused with the Russian A-60 airborne lasing platform because we have a little blow up here on the slide. You can see the insignia they put on the side of the plane. So just in case you thought that, maybe it's not used for counter-space missions. No, they made it abundantly clear for us. They've got a picture of a falcon there with a lightning bolt going up, and it looks like, a space telescope, something like the Hubble Space Telescope, I don't know, and the lightning bolt is going right into the aperture of that system. So they're making it very plain, very clear that they are building systems to target our space systems and to negate some of the advantage that we gain because of them. And also, as you can see here, it's not just the kinetic ASAT weapons. There is the Chinese DN-3 direct ascent ASAT missile you see on the lower right-hand side. But it's also all sorts of other non-kinetic means of attack, including things like these truck-mounted GPS and SATCOM jammers that Russia has fielded. And reports indicate that they've proliferated them to North Korea. And more recently, we've seen Russian jamming equipment show up in places like Syria and Ukraine. These things are being used all the time. And the intent here is to leave our forces blind and deaf in the event of a conflict. Space is simultaneously a powerful enabler and a critical vulnerability. Put simply, the United States, Australia, and other allied nations are increasingly dependent on space across the full spectrum of conflict, but our space systems are not adequately protected across the full spectrum of threats. Conflict that begins or extends into space, particularly if it becomes kinetic, will not end well for anyone. Our primary focus should therefore be on deterring conflict in space. And I believe there are three main areas where we can do more to improve our deterrence posture in space. So, first of all, we need a clearer understanding and articulation of the thresholds for escalation in space. Not just our own thresholds, but those of our allies, our partners, and our adversaries, and also understanding how all of these other actors perceive our thresholds. Now, back in 2016, my think tank, CSIS, partnered with another think tank in DC called the Secure World Foundation. And together we conducted a space crisis simulation where we tried to explore some of these topics. And one of our findings from this exercise was that escalation thresholds for conflicts in space can be ambiguous, particularly at the lower end of the spectrum of conflict. Now, as in other domains, thresholds are context dependent. The way an attack is perceived depends on the context in which it occurs. And each side can have differing views of their own thresholds and their perceptions or misperceptions of the other side's thresholds. What's different about the space domain is that we don't have much history to draw upon or widely accepted norms of behavior. In the maritime domain, if someone fires shots across the bow of your ship, you understand what that means. You understand that it's a warning. And there are rules of the road. There are ways that you operate in shipping lanes. Now, I've heard it said before that speed limits don't stop people from speeding. They just allow you to identify who the speeders are. Similarly, norms of behavior in space will not stop the bad actors, but it will allow the good actors to quickly identify rogue behavior. Another complicating factor is that adversaries can use forms of attack against our space systems that are sometimes difficult to detect, attribute, and deter. Some types of attacks, such as jamming, are temporary in nature, while other methods of attack, such as using a laser to blind the satellite sensors, may not be readily visible to others. So these attacks can happen, and no one else may even realize that anything has happened. Moreover, if you're the operator of a satellite that's being dazzled or blinded, do you really want to acknowledge what just happened and give your adversary that battle damage assessment to know if what they were intending to do was actually working or not? Now, many methods of non-kinetic attack against space systems, including cyber attacks against ground stations, can be difficult to attribute in a timely manner. It's nearly impossible to deter an attack if you can't attribute the source of the attack or know with confidence that the effects being experienced are in fact malicious in nature. Improvements in our ability to detect and attribute the full range of threats to our space systems not only enhance deterrence, it also provides an asymmetric advantage, and it gives us a powerful tool to control escalation on our own terms. But if escalation thresholds are left ambiguous, it can invite gray zone aggression in space. Now, we're already seeing gray zone aggression in other domains today, where adversaries are probing at the seams, and they're trying to find ways to create problems for us or advance their own ambitions, but without triggering direct, overt conflict. The same thing can happen in space. We need to be prepared for that. Now, a second area where we should be focusing more effort is enhancing and augmenting space capabilities with our allies and commercial partners. We are all in this together. It is a joint international force in space. We are dependent on one another. As I mentioned before, we're in the midst of a renaissance in commercial space. And many commercial firms are making advances to do things that used to be the exclusive domain of governments. That makes a lot of people uncomfortable, particularly in our intelligence communities. The surface of the Earth and the space environment itself are becoming more transparent, whether we like it or not. This is not something we can stop. Now, on balance, I believe this is a positive development for those of us who believe in a rules-based global order, because it makes it more difficult for rogue actors to operate in secrecy. They know we can see what they're doing. I think that's a positive thing on balance. But the challenge here for our militaries is to stay attuned to the advances in commercial space, and it is commercial space that are driving many of these capabilities that make Earth and space more transparent. To stay attuned to these advances and to keep pace with the speed at which innovation is occurring. Now, in the U.S. military, we have a system called the Planning, Programming, Budgeting, and Execution System, PPBE. If any of you are familiar with it, if you've worked with the U.S. government, that's the system that we use internally within DoD to develop our annual budget request. And then, once it goes to Congress, there are the authorization and appropriation processes in Congress that they use to provide funding and oversight. These processes are simply too slow. Even when they work as intended, and often they don't, this year is a great example. We're almost halfway through our fiscal year, and we still do not have appropriations passed by Congress. But even when they work as intended, it takes about 2 years from the time you have an idea for a new program or a new initiative to when you have money that you can actually put on a contract to start work on that idea. Any of you who work in the acquisition environment know that when you're putting money on a contract, that's just the very beginning. That's just when you're starting work. And it takes us 2 years just to get to that starting point. In that amount of time, the commercial space industry will have already progressed to a new generation of technology, maybe 2 generations. Not to mention how long it then takes us once we start a program to go all the way through the acquisition process and ultimately field a new capability, a new weapon system of some kind. That's one of the reasons that we are continuing to launch wideband global SATCOM satellites, our wideband systems that provide about 3 gigabits of data throughput per satellite. That program, I remember when it started back in the early 2000s. We're still building and launching those satellites today because that's how our acquisition process works, where In the commercial satellite communications industry, they've gone through multiple cycles of development and technology. And now, Viasat, one of the commercial companies, is launching satellites where they're using various types of technology to achieve 300 gigabits per second of data throughput per satellite. Literally a factor of 100 that they are improving their data throughput. Now, in addition to all of these things, the window of opportunity for some things like hosting a military payload on a commercial satellite may only last a few months. If it takes us 2 years to get the funding to go forward with an initiative, the window of opportunity will have closed. Innovation's not just about having great ideas and new technologies. It's also about being prepared to take advantage of opportunities when they materialize. Now, a third and final area I believe needs more attention is the problem of communicating thresholds and capabilities. Communication is a critical part of deterrence and our ability to manage escalation in a crisis. We must be mindful that as space is becoming more transparent, some of the capabilities and operations that we used to be able to keep secret in the past may not be secret any longer. And I know that's hard for many the folks who work in our space operations community to come to grips with this, but we can't keep pretending that people can't see things we know they can see. Even with commercial technology, they can see what we're doing. Secrecy invites suspicion among our allies and partners and does little to deter our adversaries. Put simply, an adversary cannot be deterred by something it does not know exists. While certain aspects of our national security space systems must remain secret to be effective, too often the United States and its allies default to overclassification. Now, it was an encouraging first step when DoD declassified the existence of the Geosynchronous Space Situational Awareness Program, GSAP, back in 2014. I believe that this disclosure enhances our security and helps deter aggression in space because the whole world is now on notice that we're watching what others are doing in geosynchronous orbit. We can see you. I would like to see us go a step further to name and shame bad actors in space, those who conduct irresponsible, aggressive, or hostile activities, and back it up with hard data. I'd love to have a picture one day to put on a slide up here that shows you some of these objects that we're tracking in space. You know, something that Russia launches, doesn't declare it, it gets cataloged as a piece of debris. A few weeks, few months go by, and then we see the piece of debris maneuvering. Kind of funny that debris can maneuver like that. I'd like to see a picture of that on the front of the New York Times. I think that would be appropriate. Now, also, the overclassification of information inhibits our ability to work with international partners and commercial firms, both of which can play an important role in improving the resilience of our space systems. Classification issues can make it difficult to discuss escalation thresholds with other nations, even some of our closest treaty allies like Australia. Now, lowering classification levels where appropriate would ease the integration of more allies and partners into our space operations. We build up so many different levels and so many different firewalls within our space operations that sometimes even within the United States, we have problems with one organization sharing information with another organization, and we're all supposed to be on the same team. Similarly, overclassification makes it difficult to work with many commercial firms, especially those that are new to doing business with the government and may not have any cleared personnel within their organizations. As someone who's worked at a small space startup before, I can tell you that that is a big barrier to entry and a disincentive to doing work with the government. Also, sometimes the licensing process gets hung up for licensing purely commercial space missions because someone, somewhere in our interagency community will flag something and say, aha, that's a security issue, and then they can't even talk to the company about what it is and why they're flagging it. And, you know, it could be that it's something that's very easy to clear up. Now, Another way to improve communication of thresholds is to be more explicit with commercial satellite service providers about how attacks on their systems will be treated. The new U.S. National Security Strategy that was released back in December of 2017 says that the United States will, quote, consider extending national security protections to our private sector partners as needed. Now that's a step in the right direction, but more clarity is needed. What kind of protection will be provided, financial or otherwise, and under what conditions will these protections be triggered? You know, one of the things that's been discussed that I think the U.S. and other countries need to look at is, do we need to provide some sort of an indemnification program for commercial space companies when they do business with the government? Because in the event of a conflict, they very well may be targeted. And looking at it from a business perspective, that's a risk they're not going to be able to insure. Insurance companies don't like to underwrite acts of war. So we need to think about this in advance, because when you get into a crisis situation and businesses are being put at risk, capital is being put at risk, you don't want to be scrambling at that time to figure out how we're going to reassure our commercial partners that are an important part of our space architecture. The U.S. military is already dependent on commercial operators for satellite communications, imagery, and many other capabilities. An adversary may seek to attack these commercial systems simply as a way of signaling intent or resolve, believing that their actions are below the threshold for military conflict. I think that would be a big miscalculation on their part, but without clarity on how such attacks would be treated, commercial space operators may not be willing to accept the risk of doing business with the military in the event of a crisis. We need to think about this carefully and ensure that doesn't happen. So in conclusion, much remains to be done to improve our deterrence posture in space for the wide range of threats we face today. I believe these efforts should focus on the three areas I've outlined here: clarifying escalation thresholds in space, enhancing and augmenting space capabilities and the speed at which we innovate, and improving how we communicate thresholds and capabilities to others. If you'd like to learn more about the thoughts that I've shared here and learn more about the space crisis simulation that I mentioned, you can download a copy of our latest report, Escalation and Deterrence in the Second Space Age, at our website here. Within that, you can find in the appendix, we have the methodology and all of the scenarios that we used for the space crisis simulation. So you can look those over and feel free to use them in your own work. Of course, if you have any questions, I'd be happy to address them later in the conference or at the Speaker's Corner after this event in the lobby. And I thank you all for all your time and attention to this important topic. Thank you.